Hello, hello. I have now compiled the upskilling survey that I completed, as well as a checklist study guide of sorts for other people to use if they're considering moving into the instructional design area. So I hope that will help. I will link that in the description. As you can see, in regards to how much are instructional designers spending to upskill, you can see half are spending between $1,000 and $5,000 on their upskilling. Now, while mine ended up being slightly higher than this, as you can see, the 5 to 10K range is the next highest area at 20%. I think that's the 1 to 5,000 is actually pretty reasonable number to make a career change. I've made other career changes in the past, and spending close to $5,000 has not been unusual. I'd also argue that it does pay off. I've never regretted any of those expenses. Not to say that finding that money can isn't easy. I've definitely been in that position to question my choices, and I'd never encourage anyone to spend their money, especially too early in the process of investigating if the career path is right for you. That's part of when I put together my checklist is to get you thinking about not only instructional design, but whether you fit in with that field, because there are a lot of other um, adjacent fields that might be a better fit for you. That being said, sometimes you do have to invest in yourself if you really want to make a change. So, what actually are instructional designers spending money on when they upskill? I didn't include LinkedIn Learning here because you can access that for free in many cases. But I think it's interesting that the most popular is books, which kind of makes sense for people who love learning, right? For academies, I was referring to people who would pay to be in a cohort group, which is similar in a lot of ways to a boot camp, but the boot camps tend to have a somewhat higher cost and often have that focus on maybe being a bit more rapid. For the MOOCs, that's more self-paced, so that's a little different for me than a one-off standalone course. But all of these have some overlaps. And the written feedback questions contain mentions of specific master's programs, specific boot camps and academies, as well as a few comments and concerns about purchasing software as something that you're spending money on. I didn't focus on that for this specific question, but it does come up and is kind of a refrain throughout this whole study. Not everyone answered this question, but it's pretty short and sweet and obvious that everyone who did use YouTube to upskill, and I think many of us that's where we started. I'll discuss a little later in this very video are areas that learners wish they were covered in more detail for those of you who are working on LinkedIn videos. You can see LinkedIn Learning, of course, is another big area that I do consider free since most people can get it through library access, but if not, you could consider that an effective expense. And then there's also blogs and articles. I did not see as much mention about podcasts, but I know that is something that is likely used a bit more than maybe was reported in this survey. The results from the survey about learning theory were interesting, and I can understand kind of the discomfort with that, even though I'd come from teaching. You can see a definite lean towards these responses into e learning principles. So I'd say about a third may not be as clear on actually what learning theory might be versus design principles. And about 20%, although I'd argue that's probably higher, knew the theories at some point, but they didn't stick. I'd probably put myself in that category quite often. So that's why my recommendation is to pick one or two that you can really explain as part of your design process when you're interviewing or writing up about your projects. This seems to be the area in learning theories that most people are nervous about when they apply. To jobs. I didn't include backwards course design with this, but someone did mention it. And I probably should have had a separate section for strict theory versus design principle. But this to give you some idea of what people are really thinking about. And I also want to say cognitive load is probably a good one that people are thinking about it, Butch, because I am seeing that the most in a lot of the work I've been doing. And then again, backwards design that wasn't listed on here is also a really good one to have in your back pocket. When we think about upskilling and looking at analyzing needs, especially for those coming out of teaching who mainly probably analyze the needs of their individual classroom, it's very cool to see that action mapping generally has an edge here because that's one that I think is pretty easy to access through books and videos that are available out there. The other software programs, many of them you can try for free as well. There were a lot of comments with this about using Google Forms or other survey forms. For some, there was the question here of with so much remote work, would you do more surveys now versus job shadowing and interviews? I could have expanded this a bit more to include more of remote interviewing, but that is covered a little bit when we think about collaboration. When we think about visual design, that was an area that I was particularly nervous about. And a lot of people address the issues that come up with access again here. So you can see we're pretty close to people either using something free, for most of us free, PowerPoint, or Adobe products, which you do have to pay for, but at least you can do by month. Canva's pretty close in that. The other category, people mention using a combination of tools as well as some direct design in Publisher or even just an articulate storyline itself. So when we think about collaborating, it was pretty clear that most people are using a combination of tools, with a lot of people using shared documents in various formats. I was surprised video chats actually wasn't a little bit higher on this, but I guess when you think about it in combination, maybe that makes sense. And I didn't originally include it on the survey, but a lot of people did mention Slack and other asynchronous ways of communicating. So these just to give you a general overview of how we're collaborating these days. Well, when it came to what instructional designers are learning to author learning experiences, this was pretty resounding. We have over 80% in Storyline, a little bit in Rise, which I think most of us would say if you're using Rise, it's pretty easy to figure out. A few in Captivate. And in the other category, I had people mentioning Genially and EduFlow. And there are probably other cheaper or free options out there that we're all just not focusing on as much because there is this real push for using Storyline. I know I did pay for it after my free trial, and I got an academic license after my trial, even though I don't currently use it in my job. Although my freelance work, I may possibly use it. So it's really a tough decision. I think it's good to at least be able to try it, but I've often recommended to people to try and storyboard, maybe build some things and free tools before you pay for your license or before you even start your trial to see how much you can get done before you have to pay for access. When it comes to instructional designers and upskilling with an eye towards implementing learning experience, a lot of people did indicate having some experience in an LMS or as a facilitator or an instructor. Um, and the rest kind of mentioned having some work in other types of e-learning tools or as an SME themselves. I got quite a few comments about EduFlow. So maybe this is an area where you can differentiate yourself a bit if you're able to talk about your ability to implement. I know in a lot of jobs, it seems when I was looking at the descriptions that you wouldn't necessarily be doing the implementation, that went to someone else, but it could be good to at least have a little bit of that in your toolkit. When it comes to the end of that whole ADDIE process idea and you get into evaluating, this is another area that's a little harder to do if you haven't worked as a teacher or in the actual field. So with that, you have a lot of people who have done that work, either doing surveys or assessments. We do have almost half looking at interviews, and then at the bottom we have kind of that other area with some of the more formal KPIs, but then again also more informal share outs with their teams or other staff who do that work for them. So I wish I had done more of this for example, for the first project I released. Um, I didn't really do a formal survey or anything. I kind of did informal evaluation from other people, but now I'm starting to do that, at least linking a survey within modules that I create to get some feedback from people so you can improve and to get an idea of who's completing the work. So it's good to have that data. And that's something that, again, you can set yourself apart if you're able to show that you've been able to collect some data. So, just a quick note about publishing portfolios. A lot of people were using Google Sites, but I did get a lot who said they were using something else. But really, most of that 45% were people who still had those development. So this raises a question again of when do you release your portfolio, because it's always going to be a work in progress, or should be. So it's something to think about, trying to get that out into the world earlier to get feedback on it and to start adding something. I know for myself, I add a portfolio before I had, say, a storyline project. So I was able to showcase other things. So that's a decision to make, and I have a whole other video where I think about that. There was also quite a few mentions of Wix and a growing popularity for Webflow and a kind of falling popularity, it seemed, for WordPress. So when we think about what other tools instructional designers are using or upskilling on, video conferencing came out at 100%. We did have a pretty good percentage of people who are also at least familiar with project management tools, and a very small percentage with data analytic tools. And I always like to mention these because there are a lot of adjacent fields when you're working with some project management, data analysis, UI, UX kind of tools. I didn't get into those tools here because they can also follow under needs analysis and some of the visual design areas. Again, this is an opportunity to be able to show your ability to work in some of these. You could create content as well. Like if you're good with Monday.com or say a Trello, could you make a video to kind of show yourself working? And that can network for you and also build some content for the community. So we're in the home stretch on these videos, and as you can see, instructional designer is at the top of the list for the job titles that people who took this survey are looking for. People are also getting more exposure to learning experience designer, and we had quite a lot for e-learning developer. We had some others that were mentioned a little bit less, and even a few mentions of things like trainer and facilitator. But by and far, these three were the highest. Speaking of clear winner, LinkedIn is by far the place where people are looking for most of their jobs these days. Um, Networking is very high, and as you can see, we have a few other areas that people are searching for. Also had some comments with some good reminders about looking at Glassdoor for reviews, and sometimes there's jobs posted there as well. When we get into the freelance realm, you get into a whole host of other things with flex jobs, Upwork, etc. So I have some comments coming up about other things people are looking for, but I think also talking about how to look for freelance work or whether or not you should churn on your recruiter, you're open to work. These could be great topics for anyone making content about LinkedIn as well. As we get towards the end of the video, we get into one of our more contentious areas. How much should entry-level instructional designers make? Now, these numbers really probably looking more towards corporate. Again, as you can see, the area in blue, that would probably be more of your higher ed range, and then your corporate would go up from there. I'm actually a little surprised to see how many people go into the 71 to 80K range, because from the jobs I looked at, that seemed to be a bit more of the going into kind of leadership roles. So I saw a lot more that were in that 60 to 70 to start. Again, some of this depends on your location, but I'm primarily thinking of remote positions that may not take in location as much. And then we still had quite a few who were even higher than that, in the 20% into the 80K range. So I think there needs to be some more studies about this. It's hard to find out pay ranges, but there's also something else we don't talk about as much, and I'd like to see more videos about, is speaking to work-life balance. You may have a position that you're making 70, $80,000 a year. However, you're working over 48 hours a week. What are your benefits like? How many days off do you get? Can you work remotely, or are you going to be more in a hybrid role? So there's probably some more conversation to have about that, and as much transparency as we possibly can get. All right, here's my last full slide to tell you what some instructional designers want from the community as they're working on their upskilling. By far, the biggest was the business side of freelancing. And along with that, also this can come up with sometimes with contract jobs, is what are the different pay issues, W-2 versus 1099 versus LLC, etc. And I think people could speak to this without being a legal representative and just say, "Hey, I'm not a legal representative." But I think a lot of people are interested in freelancing, but finding out how to do it and what the ins and outs are is difficult to locate. So that's definitely an area I know I'd like to know more about. There's also more help wanted with how to describe your current skills in ID terms. I tried to do a little bit of this when I talked about changing my resume, but I didn't go into a lot of detail. So I think we definitely could do a bit better with that. Also, more thoughts about cost effective ways to manage upskilling expenses. Maybe a good advice video about how you can kind of plan your process so that you can use free trials as much as possible. But at some point, there's probably going to be some expense. You can get away without doing it. I mean, I have to be honest. I got the position I am, but I am in a higher ed position, which is on a lower pay scale, and I got that without doing a lot of upskilling. I had to do some, so I hadn't spent a lot, but I eventually did to build my skills. There's also some specific ones in here about walkthroughs that could be helped in storylines. So if you're able to help with any of those, I'm sure people would really appreciate that. And again, walking through the whole ID process so that it's easier to explain in a portfolio. Again, that's for people who maybe haven't done it specifically, but have done something similar. Like when I came out of teaching. I will say with any of that though, you'll be able to explain it as much as you can, but every job is so different, and you won't really know until you're actually in the job. Um, so my closing slide will come up in a minute. Let me know if you have other questions about this, about the survey, about the checklist I'm going to share in comments or comments in the information section. And I'll be here to help you as much as I can. And let me know if there's something personally you'd like me to cover in my role or in my process. Take care.